Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to the Ephemeris podcast. I'm your host, Aphelion, and I had a look back on yesterday's episode, and it just seemed like the production was a bit of a rush, admittedly. Um, but I think it was still a pretty decent episode. I put quite a lot of effort into researching it, and then I realized, oh, wait, hold on, there might be a couple of flaws with the chronological order. And then when I researched American civilization, I realized, oh, actually, you know what? The time scale is not too distorted when we look at the Persians before the Mayans. But I think it still will make sense if we cover the Persians just before the Greeks instead of, having the Mayans there a little bit. That would be a little bit of a weird of a mix. Wow, I don't know what I even said there, but anyways, that's besides the point. As promised yesterday, we are talking about Maya civilization, but I think it's a little bit worthwhile to look at the Incans and the Aztecs, so we'll kind of just encapsulate Mesoamerican civilization. So, without further ado, let's get straight into the Mayans first, because that's where a bulk of the cosmology we're going to learn about is. So, firstly, the most famous and notable thing about the Mayans were their calendars. This was a big frenzy, or there was a big frenzy about the end of the world in 2012 because people pointed to the end of the Mayan calendars. So, that's kind of where a bit of the fame part comes in. But there's more to the story, of course. So, the Mayans had three types of calendars, and I'll get into why the calendar stuff is kind of important to astronomy in a bit. But let's talk about the three types of calendars. The long count is a tally of the days since the supposed creation of the universe or the solar system. It's just known as the creation date, mythical creation date, which is quite vague. So I'm going to assume that that means the supposed creation of the universe. And so this tally and the long count is supposed to date back to around 3114 BCE in the Gregorian calendar, what we use today in the Western world. And in terms of how they actually keep tally going on from that date of creation, it's complicated. The tally has like five orders of numbers, and it's like a 20 base count. So, 20 of one number is going to, create a zero in that place and then a one in the next order of numbers. But the third order has an 18 base count instead of a 20. And so, yeah, that is a little bit funky. But, anyways, there are some more short term calendars which are going to be more important to us. And those calendars are going to be I believe it's called the Tzolk'in. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And then the Hob. So the Tzolk'in is a 260-day calendar, and the days cycle from 1 to 13 days. However, each day is given 1 out of 20 names, which means that across the year, every day is quite unique. So it's given a specific day number, but it's also given a specific day name and a specific combination of a day and a name only happens once a year. So it's a very unique calendar, right? And this calendar wasn't used completely like practically. It was more of a religious type purpose kind of calendar. It would, help determine stuff like, the agricultural season, farming, and religious ceremonies. So the Hob was a little bit less complex than that and it was more practically used. Is 365 days, 19 days per one of 18 months, with 5 unlucky days at the end. And yeah, so these two calendars you'll see across, I think, all three Mesoamerican civilizations in some shape or form. If not the Incas, definitely the Aztecs, which we will talk about very, very briefly. But yeah, so those are the two short term calendars, but um, the same combination of a given Tzolk'in date, its name, and its corresponding Hob date altogether only happen once every 52 years. I'll get into why that's important in just a second because, as I've said, The Aztecs use that calendar, and this occurrence of every 52 years comes into play. Um, but yeah, in terms of the Maya, which is kind of our focus here, I know I went a little bit off on a tangent about the Aztecs, but for the Mayans, right, it was important because they used the Solcan calendar more specifically to record the dates when Venus disappeared from the night sky. So I think that's a good transition into discussing the astronomical observations of the Maya and how sophisticated they were in their calculations. So, I just mentioned how they observe Venus. Their main records are in the Dresden Codex, and it's one of the few Mayan codices still remaining. And basically, what that means is a lot of the kind of books or texts that the Mesoamerican civilizations had were lost. They were lost in history. And so basically, the Dresden Codex is just one of the few that still remain, and you can find records of Venus in that thing. The Maya, they track the synodic cycle of Phoenix. What Venus? Sorry, my speech is a little bit weird today, but they track the synodic cycle of Venus, which pretty much means it's tracked Venus similar to how you track the phases of the moon. And they calculated the rise of Venus in the night sky, and I believe the set as well, very, very accurately. It's even noted today that it's a very accurate calculation for the time. All right, so the Maya also had almanacs of other planets, such as Mars, Mercury, and then this was a bit of a far reach, but historians believe that there were certain events that occurred in Maya culture that aligned with events in Jupiter's and Saturn's orbit. It's a bit of a complicated thing because it's not like they had like measurements of kind of the movement of planets like Mars or Mercury, but there were certain stages in kind of Jupiter's and Saturn's orbit, which is quite intricate, that aligned with some events in the Solcan calendar. But yeah, that one, the Jupiter and Saturn part is a little bit more complicated, but the Mars and Mercury is just they had almanacs. So yeah. Now, the last thing left, obviously, would be the sun and the moon in the solar system. So let's get right into that. So the sun. The Maya had very, very good awareness of the solstices and equinoxes. And this is a theme that's going to pop up quite often, I will mention. Okay. We know this because of how good their alignment of buildings to zenith was. Like, Mayan structures, I don't know if they're temples or not. I'm going to assume they're temples, right? They were built to observe overhead passage of the sun, which only occurred twice a year. So they were very precise in building buildings so that every twice a year, when the sun would be directly overhead in the tropics, that temple would be able to observe it. So, because of how good their building alignments were, and their kind of, I guess you could call it zenithal alignment as well, we know that they had a very, very good awareness of kind of how the sun went up in the horizon and down across the year. So, as for the moon, the Maya calculated the length of the moon's synodic cycle only a couple of 10,000ths off of the accepted value, 29.5302 days versus 29.5305 days, which is the accepted value today. And this measurement is actually more accurate than Ptolemy himself. And we're obviously, in the next episode, going to get into Greek astronomy and cosmology. We're going to hopefully talk about Ptolemy because I think he was one of the earlier ones, but yeah. At the time that the Mayans were doing this, they had better accuracy than Ptolemy. I will mention that the method that the researchers used to conclude that the Maya kind of created this value, it's a bit of a far reach. Like, you'd have to do some interesting mathematics to kind of get this result. Because the thing is, the Maya people, they didn't use fractions, so you'd have to go off a lot of premises. But anyways, other than that, Mayans identified 13 constellations. Not as impressive as the Persians, but I mean it's definitely something. The one really really important thing about the Maya though is the fact that they had no advanced technology to conduct observations. It was really just the naked eye. And I think that is very, very impressive because that means that they had to have a high level of knowledge of what was up above to have, to be that amount of knowledge to be sufficient enough for them to create the best structures for observation and suffice. Like, you have to be really, really good with your astronomy, right? And they created quite something out of nothing, I will say, in my opinion. And with that, it's time to give note to the Aztec and the Inca, right? Let's start with the Aztecs, as I've frequently mentioned them when it comes to the calendar stuff. So obviously, the Aztecs had a similar calendrical system to the Maya, but I think a more distinct part about their calendrical system is they had beliefs attached to the specific combination of the Hab and the Tzolk'in calendars in Maya culture. Obviously, they called it their own calendars, or they called those calendars their own names, but it was still the same system, and that kind of unique occurrence of the two calendars every 52 years. They believed that if God didn't pass the Pleiades constellation across the zenith every 52 years, the world would end, which I think is quite interesting. It's definitely more of a mythology aspect, but I think it's still pretty fun, a fun fact. But anyways, if God did pass the Pleiades constellation across the zenith, then it was celebrated and there was a festival. So other than that, I mean, the Aztecs, it was very similar to the Maya, and so I think let's shine a little bit of light on the Inca. Um, just a follow up. So they used astronomical events more heavily for agriculture, I believe. They use it more heavily than the Maya. They would use the alignment of the sun's rise and fall between pillars, like literally just two pillars, to determine at what altitude to grow crops, which is crazy because, I mean, we understand the importance, at least, kind of when we analyze it from the outside, right? We understand the importance of growing crops at certain altitude in the Andes today as, like, modern people. But the fact that the Inca, like, literally, they used the sun, naked eye observations, put two pillars up and determined, hey, if the sun is at this point between two pillars, we must grow at this altitude. I don't know. I just think that's crazy. Like, that is extremely sophisticated, and considering how difficult the geographical conditions are because of the importance of changing the altitude for growing crops, right? It's mind-boggling. So yeah, they had so many ways to track solstices and autumn equinoxes. It has to do with this. I believe from the story, it has to do with this cave and how the sun kind of shines on certain walls in the cave, which is, again, I would have absolutely no clue like how to connect two and two by using the sun hitting walls on a cave, and like what part of the sun's phase in the year it is. Like, I don't know. It breaks my brain. I'm almost struggling to speak because it's like very difficult to it's very difficult to construe words to explain how like mind-boggling that is. But anyways, I'm waffling. Anyways, so the Inca were one of the few civilizations who were able to locate their constellations without the presence of stars, which is, I think, quite unique. So they like they were heavily invested in the idea that the stars and the lack of stars represented animals and their well-being, which is very unique to them. Obviously, I don't have the deeper explanation to why they did that, but it's definitely a fact. And so yeah, that given that they were heavily invested in this idea once again. They're one of the few civilizations who are able to locate their constellations without the presence of stars. And I found this quote from Scientific America, and I think it explains the observations of the Inca quite nicely. So they said, quote, although they lacked telescopes, clocks, or any sort of modern technology, they knew enough to build structures that told an entire empire of 12 million people when to farm, to harvest, to shelter crops from coming rains, to hold religious celebrations, and so much more. So, if my explanation of why I think the Inca were so magnificent in their observation, if my explanation wasn't good enough, I think that quote sums it up perfectly. Um, and yeah, I think that's a great place to wrap up Mesoamerican astronomy. I think just like the Persians, it's a bit of an extension of astronomy to uh, different corners of the world, and we don't have much to say about it these days. But I think it's definitely quite an interesting aspect of astronomy to look into, and I think a lot of the stuff that I talked about in this episode really goes to show the caliber of intelligence that Mesoamerican civilizations had that unfortunately we did lose. And it does disappoint me that we not only refuse to talk about eras of history like this, but also that Mesoamerican culture was almost completely lost due to, European conquest of America, and I obviously don't have place to speak on matters like that. If I wanted to do research on it and come up with an actually solid opinion, I would, but I mean, that's kind of not the purpose of this podcast and not really what I want to do either. So I think, all in all, just not to end on a low note, I think we should be appreciative of the fact that at least we know something about these civilizations rather than nothing. And if you want to learn about it, there's still kind of historical ruins like Machu Picchu. You can go there, you can learn from the native people about some traditions that were not lost. So, yeah. Anyways, that is the end of the episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed listening to the episode. If you did and you're listening on Spotify, make sure to drop me a follow. And if you're listening on YouTube, I would highly, highly, highly appreciate a subscribe and even a like. And if you have any thoughts, definitely leave it in the comments below. I believe Spotify has a Q&A. I don't think that's gone away. So if you have any thoughts, there will be a question up there that says, what did you think of the episode? And you may leave a comment. But anyways, that's enough about comments. Until the next episode next week, I will see you guys later. Peace.